Our next presenter is Professor Robin Darling-Young, Associate Professor of Church History at the Catholic University of America, and our own Father Luke Dysinger is going to introduce Professor Darling-Young, and then we'll hear from her. We have the text that we circulated in PDF that I'll share in a moment, and then we'll have a time for questions at the end. So, Father Luke.
Thank you. It's a very great pleasure and privilege to introduce my friend, Dr. Robin Darling-Young. Such a big
it's okay.
We've known each other for, well, a fair number of years. There's a patristics conference that meets at Oxford every 4 years, and on those occasions, we certainly exchange important learned ideas, but perhaps even more important, we've shared more than one pint at the Eagle and Child Pub, where C.S. Lewis and Tolkien used to meet fairly regularly. We've sort of made that a bit of a tradition. Robin is coordinating. She is actually in charge of producing an English version of the Practicos, Gnosticos, and Kephalaia Gnostica, a great trilogy by one of the Desert Fathers, Evagrius Ponticus, who is my favorite author. She's also producing a translation from the Syriac of Evagrius's letters. And I believe it's in that area of the literature of the, not just the Eastern Christian Church, but the churches of the East, the churches that have used Syriac as their written and especially their liturgical language, that she has been able to contribute tremendously recently. And I hope she'll tell us something about that expertise during the course of her sharing with us. So again, Robin, thank you very, very much for joining us, and we're delighted to have you today.
Thank you, Father Luke. It's great to see you. And I too, let me say, am happy that the community is safe. It was a wonderful pleasure maybe 5 years ago to visit Palermo when we were all working on something having to do with Evagrius. So working on translating one of his works. I have to add to your introduction, I have to add that probably the first translation of Evagrius that will see the light of day is a translation that I have made of the Armenian version of his letters, which is so interesting because the Armenians have, whenever they received the translation, probably in the 8th or 9th century, they turned the Syriac translation of Evagrius's letters into a correspondence between himself and a devoted woman, which I think is wonderful because it didn't happen, but it's a great idea. So, I mean, he did write letters to a woman, but his whole collection is written to many people. At any rate, let me get to the point here, which isn't in the first instance Evagrius, although there will never be a public occasion when I wouldn't mention his name, and in that I think I just take after Father Luke. but if we are talking about the ideal community, utopias, then it is natural to turn to the early Christian communities, which as has been pointed out, derive from a certain point of view which holds that Christianity is both for the world in the sense of a kingdom, which all kingdoms are invited to join, but it is also very much aimed toward the fostering of a smaller community depending upon reformed persons, persons who follow a certain discipline so that they might become adequate and even illustrious citizens of this kingdom. This view of the kingdom and of community and of the ecclesia, the church, as the prime assembly of this kingdom is something which doesn't begin with Evagrius. It doesn't even begin with Origen. The interesting thing about Christianity, when we consider it as a kind of political entity in the Roman world, is that it begins with a highly controversial community in the Roman world, adapting that community to a new time and joining it to Roman political and personal philosophy, which is to say philosophy, because the philosophy of the Greco-Roman world was always at the same time personal, aimed at the reform of the person, the individual person, and at the reform of the larger political community. So how does this happen? I think the most important thing to say here that gives us a background for Origen, Evagrius, and other Christians of the early Christian period is that Christianity is Judaism plus. Ultimately, Christianity could encompass the philosophies that were mentioned in the first section of this seminar. Maybe not Epicureanism, but maybe portions of Epicureanism. But it only encompassed those philosophies on the basis of a philosophical understanding of Judaism. And I would argue, although I don't have time to prove it here, I would argue that that philosophy, that idea of Judaism as a philosophy, really begins with the Apostle Paul, but it's certainly articulated more carefully and certainly more voluminously in the thought of the early Christian theological philosophers of Alexandria. And here I am thinking of Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, and then finally Evagrius. There are others who we should mention, but since I'm concentrating today on Origen and Evagrius, I want to locate them. So when I say Christianity is philosophical Judaism for this group, and I would include Paul, what I mean is that even before Jesus, before the life and work of Jesus, Judaism had adopted, in order to interpret itself philosophically, it had adopted a version of Platonism. The important thinker in that regard for the Christian thinkers we're talking about is a man called Philo of Alexandria, who is a first century thinker, roughly contemporary with Paul, who roots Jewish practice, and particularly the practice of the law, the personal appropriation of law, and personal appropriation of worship. He roots this in his own understanding of Plato. Again, I want only to mention this just for the purpose of saying that Philo has done much of the work already for Origen and Evagrius by interpreting the Old Testament as a prior philosophical document to the philosophical documents of the Greek world, particularly Plato, and then a lot of Aristotle, which is understood in antiquity as an explicitation of Plato. I think that's important for us to remember, because modern thinkers, and particularly, I think, modern Roman Catholic thinkers, would not understand Aristotle as a Platonist, but our thinkers do understand Aristotle as a Platonist, which means that they can use his insights to draw out political implications in Plato. Okay, so I'm just going to lay that one down too. And
Okay, we're having a little technical issues here. Let's wait a minute and see if this resolves on its own. We already reconnected once with Professor Darling Young, but we'll see if this works.
we can come back to it if you're interested. If you're interested. One of the important incorporated Plato and Aristotle, and Judaism and the Roman Empire, of course, in the destruction of the temple and dissident community. That is significant for Christianity. It is using the Old Testament to prove the truth of Jesus, but also because Christianity understands itself as the full Jewish people, the fulfillment of the law of Moses. And that, of course, is thoroughly rooted in the teaching of Jesus himself. But once Philo joins Judaism, Jewish law and Jewish teaching, the understanding of prophecy, even to a certain extent, the understanding of the apocalyptic vision, the celestial visions that become prominent in Judaism under the Roman Empire. When he joins these to Greek philosophy, he means to say that Judaism is the predecessor philosophy to Greek philosophy. He means also to say that Judaism is superior to and should ideally guide the Roman Empire. That insight is also repeated in the Jewish historian Josephus, who is working at around the same time in the 1st century. These thinkers are, I think, not known well outside the outside people who tend to work on early Christianity or maybe late Second Temple Judaism, but they're extremely important because they attempt not, of course, to prepare the way for Christian philosophers. They're just encompassed by Christian philosophers. They attempt to show how the Jewish community can exist as both a devotional and law-abiding community, but also a philosophical community in which people may be happy in the world, oriented toward conduct, as any Greek philosopher would be, and oriented toward the transcendent realm. And here, of course, we have to say that the philosophy of Plato is the only, understood as also Aristotelian, is the only philosophy that would satisfy the Jewish perceived need to restate Judaism philosophically, because it's only in Platonism that the transfer of the human being and the human community to the transcendent world, and the way in which Judaism makes possible that transfer to the transcendent world. This is all only available through Platonism. So again, that's a whole different lecture. I merely wanted to say that Philo has already done much of the work that Origen and Evagrius will depend upon in their own defenses of Christianity. Now, one of the first of our authors, Origen, of course, is writing at a time when Christianity is under increasing pressure from the Roman state. It has been exposed as a threat to the Roman state, even though, of course, it has rejected this view of itself even before Origin. It's exposed as a threat to the Roman state, and therefore it's coming under increasing judicial pressure. And that increasing judicial pressure we know of as the persecutions of the mid-3rd century. So if Philo is writing in the early 1st century, it takes almost 2 centuries, not quite, but almost 2 centuries, for him to be appropriated by Christian thinkers so that they understand Christianity as a kind of philosophy indicated, I won't say described or defended, but indicated by Jesus and indicated by Paul, but requiring to be fully fleshed out to defend Christianity against the accusation of pagan teachers. Now, one of the most interesting developments, I think, in recent thinking about this clash between pagan philosophers of the 3rd century and Christian theologians of the 3rd century. One of the most interesting developments recently is a proposal by a scholar of early Christianity, Elizabeth Dysinger, that the clash between Christians and anti-Christians is a clash between 2 schools of Platonists, each of which has a very specific proposal for how to live a good life, which is also a transcendent life, enabling the return of the soul to God. If we think of Platonism in the Roman period, we think of it as having that primary objective, the promotion of the return of the soul to God. Of course, this is found in Plato, particularly in the Timaeus of Phaedrus and the Phaedo. But Platonists of the Roman imperial period will also interpret the Republic and the laws as promoting a community which makes possible the transcendent, the return to the transcendent. And whether or not this has something to do with Roman Empire and the increasing importance of the Roman emperor as a kind of a saving king is a good question. We could actually go into that, and I think it would be interesting. But I wanted to mention that in a way, this clash and the sort of expansion of these 2 philosophies of personal and political conduct begins in Alexandria, and it begins after Philo, long after Philo. It begins with the philosopher Amnias Saccas, about whom we know very little, but we can be sure, I think, that he had 2 main pupils, and one of his pupils was the greatest late Platonist philosopher. He's sometimes referred to as a Neoplatonist, and that was Plotinus, who notably recasts Plato and also tries to found a utopian community, and he does found a utopian community in Rome, as his student Porphyry attests. So there's Plotinus on the one hand and Origen of Alexandria on the other hand, both of them students of Amnias Saccas, toward the end of the 2nd century in Alexandria. Both of these students, Origen, a Christian, Plotinus, a Platonist, actually migrate to different cities in order to continue a public teaching role. They do so for different reasons, because one is in a Christian community and one is not. Origen moves to Caesarea on the coast of what is today Israel. And of course, Plotinus moves to Rome to have his school there, and possibly to have a school there because it is also the seat of the Roman emperor. During the career of Origen, and also the career of his younger contemporary Plotinus, as I've mentioned, anti-Christian sentiment begins to grow. In fact, it has already been very well expressed by an earlier Platonic philosopher named Celsus. And thanks to Celsus, and thanks to Origen's very detailed response to Celsus, which thankfully is preserved in Greek, we have a very detailed response, a rebuttal of a Platonic attack on Christianity, and a description of Christianity as a philosophical system for the good of human civilization, the oikonomia, which you could read, or I should say, excuse me, oikumene, which you could read either as a divine dispensation or civilization. So in Origen, you have an account of the provision of health for this civilization at 2 levels. One level is the level of the person he called the simpler Christian, by which he meant, if you wanted to transfer it into political discourse, you could say a not very well-educated citizen. And then at the next level, the level of the philosophical guide, you would have the educated Christian. And Origen responds to Celsus in great detail to rebut Celsus's claims that Christians are noxious, nefarious, and are in some way destroying the best parts of Roman civilization. By the way, Celsus was a Greek speaker, and he was a Greek, obviously, living in a Roman Empire, but he took it as a given that Greek philosophy would guide the Roman Empire. He writes his book about 170, and what that, of course, tells you is that he's not very different from the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who thought that Greek philosophy should guide the Roman Empire and made a personal example of it. So Origen points out that Christianity, as I say in a little paragraph at the beginning of the handout that I made, Christianity is not subversive and novel, but it is more ancient, the prior and the truer form of political assembly. And here, I think it's important to say that the word Origen uses, which is the word he finds in the New Testament, and the word that Evagrius will later use, is the word for its own public presence, ecclesia, assembly. But Christian authors, including those who wrote the works of the New Testament, as well as Origen, Evagrius, and others, knew that this word assembly for church was also the assembly for a city. So the deliberate use of the term ecclesia, those called to a council, means that they understood that already from the very beginning that Christianity, as it were, takes responsibility for and understands itself to be the guiding principle, the description of the city whose destiny is a kind of divine perfection. So this claim for the ecclesia is naturally going to greatly aggravate the Platonist philosophers with whom the two people I'm talking about today come into conflict. And it's interesting that the conflict between Christian Platonists and Hellenic Platonists, or to use an older appellation, pagan Platonists, lasts all the way up into the 6th century, after which I assume that pagan or Hellenic Platonists simply become Christians. But the dispute between the two of them over the ideal community goes on then from the 2nd through the 6th century. It's a 400-year argument, which I also think is very interesting. So for Origen, the only way that the assembly, the ecclesia, could be understood properly is not merely by the love that human beings are supposed to have for the divine. This is Plato's eros, the eros toward God. It isn't that one motion from human longing for divine, either divine united with society or united with the person. Rather, it is for, it begins with the divine love for humanity. And this we can see in the first long quotation, and maybe Dave, you could put it up on.
Yeah, I'll share that now. And one thing that's worked for me in classes, we're still having a little bit of audio problem. Maybe when I share the PDF now, you could turn your video off, but keep speaking, of course,
Yes.
and that might improve the feed a little bit. Let me,
okay, yes.
Let me share
I did it.
the text. We'll see if that helps.
Okay.
If not, we'll persevere.
Okay.
Okay, and just let me know when you want me to move this down. So here's our origin text from our handout.
Thank you. That's perfect. I'm just going to refer to the bold-faced text because Origen is verbose, Celsus was verbose, and so we're just not going to read all of it. But in this first passage, you see very strongly the emphasis upon the divine movement down or toward the human, which is the only possible foundation for human happiness, either on the personal or the communal level. So when Origen writes, "For Christians see that human and divine nature began to be woven together, so that by fellowship with divinity, human nature might become divine, not only in Jesus, but in all those who believe and go on to undertake the life which Jesus taught, the life which leads everyone who lives according to Jesus' commandments to friendship with God and fellowship with Jesus." That, in a nutshell, is for Origen, for his predecessor Clement, I would submit also for Paul, that is the core of the ideal community, or a term obviously that these men didn't use either, utopia. The the good place that is a place to be, that is a place that will come, is the place of friendship with God and fellowship with Jesus. Partial now and complete when and complete at the full inauguration of the kingdom of God. As everyone, I normally don't talk about Augustine in these when I'm talking about Origen, but this part of Origen's Contra Celsum is not so different from Augustine's City of God, which is a city ahead, but discernible in the church. It is, however, and if you could just scroll down just a little bit, David, it is, however, only, it is this assembly, the ecclesia, is discernible, but only partially, and yet discernible as vastly superior to prior assemblies. And this is what we see in the second quotation, which is in the same passage from Contra Celsum 3, with where the assembly of God is compared directly to the ecclesia of Athens. The ecclesia, which if you've ever been up to the Parthenon in Athens, you've passed walking on foot, at least the site of it you've passed. The assembly of the Athenians is riotous and in no way comparable to the assembly of God. If the person who hears this has an open mind and examines the matters with a desire to discover the truth, he will be amazed at the one who both planned and had the power to carry into effect the establishment of the assemblies of God in all places, living beside the assemblies of the people in each city. Now, Origen believes then that the kingdom of God is already living in cities like Athens, Corinth, or Alexandria. And it's living there because of the training both of the simple Christians and the more philosophical Christians who are appointed as teachers in order to guide the assembly of God. Now, that goes to a point that I want to make about both Origen and Evagrius, which is that they are utterly Roman in understanding that the philosopher is meant to guide society. And in that, they are both true Platonists of the Republic, because for them, the ruler is to be advised by the philosopher. And this is, in fact, this kind of ambition on Origen's part is, in fact, what is noticed and what helps to get him and Christianity into deeper trouble at the end of the 3rd and beginning of the 4th century, is, in fact, the Christian aspiration to advise the state, not only to advise persons, but to try to accomplish, I would venture to say, I don't think I've articulated this way before, but I want to say, to accomplish a more just state. And that just state is to be measured by the proper understanding. It might be an allegorical understanding, but the proper understanding not only of the lawgiver of the New Testament, that is Jesus, but the lawgiver of the Old Testament, who is Moses. And understanding Moses through Jesus, in effect, gives you not only a proper means of acting in yourself, that is, personally, but it also yields a proper guide to, well, for lack of a better word, statecraft. So it is both, although we distinguish these, it is both personal and political. This political view of Origen's, who, by the way, Origen had this political view. Origen believed that the Roman Empire was God's providential arrangement for the expansion of Christianity, with this offer that it makes, both for personal happiness and for political good rule. Origen believes that, and he makes it public. Where does he make it public? He makes it public, in particular, in the rather significant Roman city of Caesarea, which I mentioned. It's a city that is, in the late 3rd century and well into the 4th century, larger and far more important as the provincial capital of Palestine than the city of Jerusalem was. Jerusalem is a backwater at this point, as Origen notes in some of his homilies. So when he makes this assertion, he's making it in a very sensitive place politically. His views are noticed because at the same time that he is writing this treatise and preaching in the church of Caesarea, he is also running a school. And the school was training leaders, as schools did in that time. So Origen's views are well known, and probably for that reason, he is arrested and tortured in the Valerianic persecution. Origen's thought is, I've also, if you could just scroll down a little bit, the last bolded quotation, from the gospel we should take perhaps 2 interpretations, one profound, the other simple. The latter being that one must not be worried in the soul by anxieties about food and clothing, but must practice a simple life and believe that one is under God's providential care, being concerned only for what is necessary. Now, you might hear he says this is true from the gospel, but such a point of view could also be a point of view held by Plotinus, his well, not quite classmate, but his fellow student of Almanias Sakas. And this is a piece of advice given to the simple. He doesn't say what the profound meaning of the gospel is in this passage, but such a convergence with Platonic philosophy, not to say a substitution and replacement, which Origen has in mind, that is, a Christian Platonic philosophy, which had effects on the personal and political level. This does not go unnoticed. And a student of Plotinus's, and therefore someone who is a fellow alumna, with Evagrius, is the very important philosopher Porphyry of Tyre. Porphyry is rabidly anti-Christian. Rabid is probably too strong a word, and it's one of those automatic words. But Porphyry defends, to the best of his ability, Platonism as the best philosophy to guide the empire. And he attempted to expand pagan Platonism's remit, if you like, to encompass all members of society, from peasant to emperor, as you see, lawgiver and philosopher. And he comes in his own lifestyle and in his thinking as a Platonist, he comes very, very close to Christianity without, of course, the imitation or veneration of Christ. But clearly what he is trying to do is to displace an ever more philosophical and in fact ever more popular Christianity by advocating for a return to Platonism, now anti-Christian. And I mentioned earlier the work by Dysinger, Elizabeth de Palma Dysinger, and I'm simply going to refer to this work right now because it's interesting if you want to take a look at it, but I don't have time to go into it here. It's called A Threat to Public Piety, Christians, Platonists, and the Great Persecution. She argues that this enemy of origin, an enemy of Christianity, namely Porphyry, is the one who advised Diocletian to begin the Great Persecution and try to wipe Christianity out once and for all, and allow Platonism to take its proper place as a guide for the empire. And of course, for that reason, Porphyry is hated and loathed by later Christians. Well, not him personally, perhaps, but his thinking. And you can find it particularly in Eusebius of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Cyril of Alexandria. And in his own way, Augustine also reacts against Porphyry. Now, the interesting thing about Porphyry, though, and what makes him of continued use to Christians, is that he goes beyond Plotinus in adapting Plato to the training of the soul about which, I'm sorry, just forgotten his name, Addo, that which Addo describes. Plotinus, Porphyry, not only presents his teacher Plotinus as a great and devoted ascetic, as a pagan monk who runs a kind of pagan monastic community in Rome, he himself, in an odd echo of Christianity, enters into a celibate marriage with a woman, and he writes the treatise called On Abstinence, which is in some ways very similar to Christian sentiments about ascetic self-discipline. He advocates vegetarianism, restraint of all appetites, and the path to personal illumination through praxis or training. So Porphyry then establishes himself as an important touchstone, or perhaps combatant, for those who, at the end of the 3rd century, and here we'd have to also include Origen in a sense, end of the 3rd century and beginning of the 4th century, are beginning to take up the ascetic life in a more formal way, ultimately establishing communities that we will come to know as monastic communities. And I realize that I have talked too much about Origen, and usually do talk too much, so I'm a bad habit. So maybe what I can do is sort of point to Evagrius, and you have his, and you have quotations here that I've provided. Evagrius is best known, and here again we have to thank Father Luke for his wonderful work, written both in books and articles and made available in such a great form on the web, in introducing Evagrius and his thought to the wider world. Um, what I want to highlight about him today is how he is, and I'm afraid you'll just have to take my word for this, he is a thoroughgoing adapter of origin, not just in those doctrines about Christ or about the resurrection that made him controversial, but he tries to adapt Origen's disciplined view of the Christian life for the simple and for the more philosophical. But he does it as a person of the late 4th century, yes, reacting to Porphyry, yes, reacting also to Julian, the pagan emperor, who, like Marcus Aurelius, considered himself a philosopher. I might say not as good a philosopher as Marcus Aurelius, but at any rate. And in doing that, Evagrius, like any good Christian thinker, takes the scriptures as an example of law, but also of insight, treating them in effect as the anticipation, the prior anticipation of Plato's Republic and Laws, and the prior anticipation of the Timaeus, the Phaedo, and the Phaedrus. And he adapts scripture using this kind of philosophical angle, showing how Christians, I think all Christians, should restrain themselves from wealth, follow an ascetic life, much as Porphyry would have advised earlier, in order to rise not to insight, but to union with God, to the theosis, the, for lack of a better term, divinization that Origen also had in mind for the Christian. Now, he does this in a specific monastic context. He is living in a monastic context, but he takes up that life almost at the end of his life for the last 2 decades of the 4th century, and not even all of those, not even that whole decade, so maybe the last 17 years of his life. He's had a considerable amount of experience as a teacher. And again, teachers were public authorities. He's writing in a period when, with the exception of the reign of Julian, Christians are increasingly privileged teachers. They're increasingly bold. So we don't know what he did before he entered the monastic life, but we do know that he interprets the wisdom books of the Old Testament to be a guide for life in the world for the Christian, for the serious Christian with philosophical inclinations. The first thing that Christian has to do, and you can see these in these scholia against wealth, the Christian has to abandon attachment to riches and to material goods. Of course, this will fit perfectly with a monastic life, or fit pretty well with a monastic life. I don't want to make undue claims. But remember, this is a period when Christians are increasingly gaining wealth, and when Christian assemblies are increasingly gaining wealth. So Evagrius, following Origen, and to some extent following Plotinus and Porphyry, is advocating voluntary poverty, not only, I think, for the monk, but at least the restraint of riches for the philosophical Christians he seems to be addressing in the Scholia. He is suspicious, more possibly suspicious than Origen is, of kingship. So in his Scholia on Proverbs, he seems to polemicize against the power of the king, the basileus, which is to say the emperor in this period. And I just point to the bold-faced passage at the bottom of page 3. How will the unfaithful not have not even a penny, even though he possesses the wealth of many unfaithful people? And who are those unfaithful people? The many kings and rulers of this world. Well, they don't have faith because they don't presumably consider the lily. Who is the true king? The king is Christ. And he says in the next, Evagrius says in the next bold-faced passage, this one from the Scholia on Proverbs, if Christ is King of Kings, Shepherd of the sheep, then there will be a time when he alone is king, when the sheep cross over into the royal honor. Now, the thing that has to be borne in mind here is that in Evagrius, it is the destiny of everyone to be every faithful, disciplined, self-denying, and philosophically and theologically informed Christian to become Christ. The destination, the destiny of the Christian, the theosis of the Christian for Evagrius is to become Christ, which is also to say like the Son of Man who has nowhere to lay his head. And finally, Evagrius, just as much as Origen, but more pointedly, in these scholia or short interpretive passages, Evagrius is thoroughly oriented toward the transcendent, which is why I put the last, which is why I selected the last scholion here. What is an assembly? Well, he's thinking about Origen's assembly, which is both ecclesia, church, but not church as we think of it, the council that is authoritative in the city, in this case, the city of God. An assembly of pure souls is true knowledge of aeons and worlds and the judgment and providence in them. We'll just skip over that part for now. And if we want to talk about it, that's fine. But an assembly leader is the Christ, the begetter of this knowledge. Also, an assembly leader is the one who is purifying souls through ethical observations. Here, I put the Greek word in because it has a very wide meaning. Theorematon. He purifies souls and brings them forward to natural sight. The word is Greek theoria, which means sight, observation, or contemplation. The object of the assembly is to prepare souls to contemplate God, which actually I think does take us back to Plato's Republic. But since, as Philo would say, Plato read Moses, it really takes us back to the assembly on Exodus. Okay, now, I'm happy to discuss anything with anybody, and also to recommend the reading of Evagrius, which is a little more recherché than maybe reading Origen or or reading Seneca or Marcus Aurelius, whom I also love, I have to say.
Thank you, Professor Darling Young, for that rich presentation, and those texts, which, as I understand it, are just now being brought to light. I mean, some of the translations you're working on, we just haven't had as part of the archive of our knowledge of ancient Christianity until just the last few years. So this is a really exciting, preview for English readers in the modern world to think in a new way about our own Christian past and the resources there. Are there any student questions or any questions from our senior fellows for Professor Darling Young? If not, I have one of my own, but I always want to make sure we hear from our junior fellows first and foremost. Don't be shy.
It's okay. I understand it's all a little possibly coming out of left field. But I did want to make. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead and make your point, and then we'll hear from Father Luke.
Yes, I did want to say that the question of Buddhism was raised earlier. And many have observed a certain similarity between Evagrius and Buddhism. And there's a lot to that, but I think you notice it more because of the style of his writing, which are in short sentences meant for extended meditation. So that's a whole different topic. But for Mr. Kim, the student who raised this, I just want to say that I'm sure as Father Luke would too, I really encourage you to read Evagrius, because there you can see how perhaps some Buddhist traditions have passed to the West. And we know that actually Plotinus and some early Christians knew about Buddhism and were very interested in it because of some similarities that they took between Plato and the insights of the Buddha. Okay, that's all on that.
A great point. I'll circulate in our show notes for today's episode I'll circulate the Sienkiewicz translation of On Prayer. That might be a good place for everyone to begin. Let's go to Father Luke for a question or a comment.
Well, I was intrigued during Stefano's presentation how the philosophies that he mentioned principally arose during a time of chaos, or at least of disruption within Roman society. They become attractive when people are looking for solutions to the more or less, not quite anarchy, but kind of falling apart of various aspects of life. I wonder whether the experience of persecution, the sort of rise of monasticism as the Roman model becomes acceptable within Christianity suggests a possible similarity. Of course, one can look in the West and say that that Benedict writes in similar times, and the expansion of monasticism during the Middle Ages happens during periods of chaos and then reassembly, chaos and reassembly. I wonder to what extent there is that kind of desire for a truth that brings things together, and a wanting of the wisdom tradition to a kind of anneal society which seems to be falling apart.
I have to apologize because my audio is not very good right now, but what I think about both of these authors is that they both respond in a period of crisis to what they perceive as a social crisis, and they offer Christianity. They offer the Christian path as a means of navigation, which doesn't abandon society, but tries to orient society to its proper end. And you could say, but wait, the late 4th century is the time of the flourishing of Christianity, the expansion of churches, etc. But I think that it wasn't at all that Christians really weren't at all secure at the end of the 4th century in the thought that now they had it made. And they're still being blamed for certain events that go on in the empire. And we see this also even after Evagrius in the writings of Augustine. So the power brokers of late ancient society still blame Christianity and make it a scapegoat for the chaos, when there is chaos, of the late 4th and early 5th century. And I think that might be one thing Evagrius is responding to. And the reason that these scholia aren't addressed specifically to monks and never mention monks or monastic practice is that this is the way he uses to adapt monastic practice for people living in cities, or so that they can kind of take this insight, all these Alexandrian insights, back out into the world and, as it were, create third order, if you like, from the Catholic point of view, third order monastic situations in their own homes or in their own philosophical schools and cities.
Can I ask a question about how, just sort of to zoom out for a moment? I mean, we heard from Stefano about different ancient philosophical schools before Christianity, focusing on fear as a human driver, of political action, withdrawal as a result, reason governing politics with the Stoics, a kind of elite politics as a practical option, power with the Augustan imperial option, which is actually an evacuation of the political sphere. So now when we move into the Christian situation, and we're thinking about authors that are not immediately with Augustine's answer, maybe that's something we should talk about more soon because he keeps coming back up, but not yet with Augustine's so influential answer for the fate of Western Christianity about politics and Christianity and the state. This represents now an alternative, right? Or perhaps, or at least a whole different set of coordinates and a different conversation with Origen and with Evagrius in this tradition. And they're using strongly political words like ecclesia, assembly, and they're thinking about the politeia with the Platonic tradition, as you so carefully laid out for us. And the question I have is, so if Christianity now, not yet thinking with Augustine, but if Christianity has a different analysis of what human beings need, the salvation through love, and now the question is, what sort of politics results in that? And we're not yet at an Augustinian answer. Do you think, this is my question, do you think Origen and Evagrius represent a more optimistic politics, more optimistic about the possibilities for Christianity within its own community, performing a kind of alternative political community, a different politeia inside the ecclesia? Or is optimism, pessimism not really the right way to approach this?
Well, I would say there's a spectrum, and you have two interpretations of Origen going on in the 4th century. One is that of Eusebius. So Eusebius, who most famously wrote the church history, has a very optimistic, even foolishly optimistic view of the role of the emperor, in which he says he compares the emperor to the Logos. So if you go back to John, isn't it 2:16, I guess? Is that it? For God so loved the world. Anyway, the whole passage about the Logos, where Constantine is spoken of in terms of the Logos. He is the successor to Christ in ordering the world. Well, I think those hopes have been dashed by the time Evagrius writes, and he doesn't have that optimism. He doesn't think that Theodosius, for instance, who legislates strongly in favor of Christians, so strongly that he outlaws paganism, he doesn't think that I don't think he thinks, he doesn't talk about Theodosius, but from his remarks about kings and about wealth, I think he does not think that hope for human society is to be found in the court of Constantinople. But other Christian thinkers will think that. So there is a kind of divide that goes on in the 4th century where you will ultimately have a return of sort of divine kingship among Christian propagandists for the emperor, but you will also have people who are more Augustinian while having a perhaps more hopeful view of human nature. So famously, Origen, Evagrius, Gregory of Nyssa believed in the ultimate reconciliation of all rational beings to God. Augustine didn't believe that. Very famously, just read City of God, book 23. So I think the tradition splits, and I think the monastic tradition, the Byzantine monastic tradition, becomes actually a kind of break on that kind of political optimism. Mm. I think that's perhaps one reason why Maximus the Confessor turns back to Evagrius and back to Gregory Nazianzus, and retrofits them, or he updates them in the reign of Justinian.
Mm. And keeping in mind too that Christian monasticism, as you know better than I do, is began in a period of retreat out to the desert, away from the cities, during the imperialization of Christianity with Constantine, as a pursuit of a more rigorous personal Christianity, but in community too.
Yes, and monks often come to the city in order to remind kings. Constantinople. Mm-hmm. They often come to Constantinople in order to remind kings that they are not, in fact, the image of God on earth. Hmm.
Sometimes they come all the way from Palermo to Redondo Beach, more recently, as well. The monks returning to the city for our benefit.
But only when pushed out by the fire of God.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I hope you can return soon.
We sincerely do. Professor Robin Darling Young, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Join us on a Saturday, no less, all the way from the East Coast. And we're very grateful for your part of our community here. And we hope we can keep in touch. You're welcome anytime to come back.
I would love to. Thank you.
We're going to have to wrap up today because we are at 12 o'clock. I just want to remind you where we're heading next. In our next seminar will be with Professor Cindy Colburn and Professor Brian Green on the arts of death from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And then I'll be hosting Paul Contino from Pepperdine, known to many of you very well, on Dante. So we're now we're thinking again about human futures, but human futures in the sense of human death. And and moving also from text to images, both the images in Dante, but also actual images in art history, to consider how the Catholic imagination has imagined this common human end in that other sense. So we'll be ending with that Saturday, November 7th. It will be a dramatic week by all accounts. We will see what's going on in the world at that point in time, but we will be busy thinking about death and Dante's Inferno. So the other point I just wanted to add in closing, thank you all so much for your time, and we'll be, we'll be in touch on email before then. I'm happy to share that we do have our new, very fancy website up, or as fancy as I could manage, I have to confess. And if you'd like to go to novaforum.org, you can check it out. Maybe don't circulate it and post it on the socials quite yet. We're working on that ourselves, and we have a few bugs to work out. But you'll see your smiling faces there, far outshining the grayed out images of your senior fellows below in something the designer put together. And I thought, I can't disagree. That seems eminently appropriate. So we left it that way.
True.
I hope you enjoy it very much. And, please be in touch, as always, with myself. And I think I can speak for the senior fellows with any of them as well. If you want to be in touch with a question to follow up, If we send out texts and you think I can't make sense of these texts, I, for one, would be happy to meet with you ahead of time to chat through those things. If you have questions about chronology, I know sometimes we take things for granted, sweeping through the centuries here. I'm sure we'd be happy to talk about that. If, you know, there's a movement afoot to read something from City of God, I'd be happy to put that together as well. That might be something that perhaps is part of our conversation that we need to consider as well. We can't do everything, but we can do as much as we can try to. Unless there's any other questions or comments for the good of the group, then we'll sign off and wish you a restful rest of your weekend. Thank you all. And thank you, Professor Darling-Young.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.